Hugh Conroy had one rule about women on his land, and Eva Wells broke it before her trunk was even off the wagon. The morning she arrived, the Texas sky was the color of hammered copper, still holding the last of the summer heat even though September had crept into the calendar like an uninvited guest. Hugh was standing on the porch of the main house, arms crossed over his chest, watching the supply wagon roll up the long dirt road that cut through the heart of the Conroy, spread 40,000 acres of grassland, creek bottom, and rocky ridge that his father had carved out of nothing in 1861, the year the world went sideways. Hugh had been barely 5 years old when his father drove the first fence post into the ground. Now it was 1883, and Hugh was a man of 32 who ran this land with the same quiet authority his father had shown before the fever took him. The rule was simple. It had been simple for years. No women lived on the Conroy spread. Not permanently. Not as guests. Not as boarders or housekeepers or anything else. He had let the arrangement lapse once, back in 1878, and what followed had been the kind of complicated mess that took 2 full years and a great deal of whiskey to untangle. So the rule stood. He had told every hand on his crew. He had told the men in town. He had told the 2 spinster sisters who ran the general store in Caldwell that if they ever tried to recommend his property as lodging for wayward travelers, he would stop buying his flour from them and ride the extra 12 miles to the next town. The wagon came to a stop in front of his barn. Old Pete Dawson climbed down from the driver's bench, his knees cracking loud enough that Hugh could hear it from the porch, which was 15 yards away. Pete was 63 and had been driving supply routes between Caldwell and the surrounding ranches for the better part of 20 years. Hugh trusted Pete as much as he trusted his own horses, which made what happened next all the more surprising. "Conroy," Pete called out, pulling off his hat and wiping his forehead with a bandana the color of dried blood. "Got your flour, your salt, your axle grease, and your new saddle blankets from the tannery. And one other thing." "One other thing," Hugh repeated, not moving from where he leaned against the porch post. The canvas tarp in the wagon bed shifted. Then a hand appeared at the edge, a slim hand with capable fingers and a thin silver ring on the middle finger, gripping the wooden slat of the wagon side. Then an arm. Then a woman sat upright in the back of Pete's wagon with the kind of composure that suggested she had been riding back there for hours, and had made her peace with it long before Hugh Conroy made his acquaintance with the situation. She was somewhere in her mid to late 20s, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical knot that had partially come loose from the journey, several strands falling against the side of her neck and jaw. Her dress was a deep blue that had seen better days, dusty at the hem, and she had a canvas bag clutched in both hands in front of her as she surveyed the Conroy spread with large brown eyes that missed nothing. "Name's Eva Wells," she said to no one in particular, though her gaze had already found Hugh on the porch with the unerring accuracy of a woman who knew which man in a yard was in charge. "I was told this ranch was hiring." "It isn't," Hugh said. "Pete said it was." "Pete says a lot of things." Hugh straightened off the post and walked down the porch steps, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt of the yard with measured weight. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something severe, though not unkind. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that caught the light differently depending on the hour. Right now in the copper morning they were purely gray. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "I can cook," Eva said, already moving to climb out of the wagon without waiting for assistance. She put one booted foot on the wheel spoke and swung herself down with practiced ease, landing in the dirt without stumbling. Hugh noticed that her boots were good ones, broken improperly, not the kind of shoes a woman wore when she was simply passing through. She had planned to stay. "I can also keep accounts. I did 3 years of bookkeeping in Kansas City." "This ranch doesn't need a cook," Hugh said. "Rufus handles the cooking." "Does Rufus handle your ledgers too?" Hugh paused. Rufus did not handle the ledgers. The ledgers had been in a state of organized chaos for the better part of 6 months since Hugh's previous bookkeeper, a schoolteacher named Daniel Marsh, had packed up and moved his family to Colorado. Hugh had been doing the numbers himself, which meant they were getting done approximately once every 3 weeks when he could no longer ignore them, and probably not done correctly even then. "That's what I thought," Eva said, because apparently his pause had been answer enough. She did not wait for his permission. She turned to the back of the wagon and began to unfasten the ropes on what turned out to be a large steamer trunk, battered at the corners and stickered with the residue of old travel labels. She worked the knot efficiently, the kind of efficiency that came from practice, from moving often, from knowing that you could not always count on someone else to manage your burdens. "Hold on," Hugh said, because this was the exact moment she broke his rule, not when the wagon arrived, not even when she climbed down, but in this moment when she began unfastening her trunk with the calm assumption that she was already here and already staying. The trunk being unfastened from the wagon was the irrevocable act, the declaration, and she made it with the focused practicality of someone who had decided the answer was yes long before anyone had offered the question. "I said hold on, Miss Wells," she said without looking up from the rope. "Eva Wells. Miss Wells." He was standing directly beside the wagon now. She was close enough that he could see the freckle just below her left ear, could see that her eyes, when she finally looked up at him, were not simply brown but a warm amber brown shot through with flecks of gold, the color of creek water over sandstone in the afternoon light. He noticed all of this in about half a second and then set it aside very firmly. "The trunk stays on the wagon. The trunk has my things in it. I'm sure it does, and your things can ride back to Caldwell with Pete." "Pete isn't going back to Caldwell until Thursday," she said simply. "That's 3 days from now. Are you going to make a woman sleep in the yard for 3 days, Mr. Conroy?" He had not told her his name. She had gotten it from Pete, or perhaps from someone in town. The fact that she had gotten it at all, that she had come here specifically, that she knew who ran this place and had arranged her arrival with Pete's wagon, told Hugh that this had been planned. She was not some desperate woman blown to his doorstep by misfortune. She was a woman who had decided this was where she was going and had arranged accordingly. "There's a boarding house in Caldwell," Hugh said. "Mrs. Hennessy's. Pete can take you back when he leaves." "I've been to Mrs. Hennessy's," Eva said, and something in her voice changed very slightly, not much, but enough that Hugh caught it. There was the faintest edge there, carefully controlled, the kind of tone that lived just on the other side of a door someone had firmly closed. "I can't go back there." The silence stretched between them, filled by the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass on the east side of the property and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere past the rise. "Why not?" he asked. She met his eyes steadily. "Because the man who runs the saloon next to it has decided I owe him money I don't owe him, and the sheriff in Caldwell is his cousin. I have the receipts to prove the debt is settled, but until that particular situation resolves itself, it would be better for me to be somewhere that man cannot reach me without crossing your fence line." Hugh looked at Pete, who was suddenly very interested in adjusting something on his harness. "Pete," Hugh said. "She's telling it true," Pete said without turning around. "Charlie Briggs has been making trouble for a lot of folks. Happens the law in Caldwell has been letting him do it." Hugh rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. He looked at the trunk. He looked at Eva Wells, who was watching him with those amber-brown eyes and had not, he noted, asked him for pity or sympathy or anything at all. She had stated her situation with the directness of someone who was accustomed to solving her own problems and was asking for nothing except a fair chance to solve this one. "The bunkhouse is for the hands," he said finally. "There's a room above the tack room in the barn that was used as an office. It has a window, a cot, and a stove. It isn't much. I've slept in worse," she said. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he looked at the trunk. "Clem," he called out, and a rangy young cowhand appeared from around the side of the barn as if he'd been waiting, which he probably had, because the whole yard had been watching this exchange with poorly concealed interest. "Help Miss Wells with her trunk." Clem came forward, hat practically spinning in his hands. He was 19 years old and had the reddened ears of someone who had been listening from about 8 feet away. "Yes, sir, Mr. Conroy." Hugh turned and walked back toward the house without another word, because if he stood there another moment he was going to say something, or notice something else about the freckle below her ear, or observe something further about the way she had unfastened that rope with the ease of a woman entirely capable of managing her own affairs, and none of that was useful to him. The rule had been broken. Eva Wells was on his land, and her trunk was already off the wagon. She was good at the books. That was the first thing Hugh had to admit to himself, and he admitted it 3 days after her arrival, when she placed a neatly organized ledger sheet on the table in front of him during the dinner that Rufus had prepared, which was beef stew that tasted like the cow had still been alive when it went in the pot. She had found the account books in the wooden crate he kept them in, which also contained a broken bridle strap, 6 letters from the Cattle Growers Association he had not answered, and a newspaper from April. "Your accounts receivable and payable are both a mess," she said, sitting down across from him with the frank ease of someone who had already decided they were colleagues rather than strangers. "You've been overcharged by the feed store in Caldwell for the past 4 months, $14 total. Also, you're owed $60 from a man named Gideon Hartley for cattle he bought in June. I found the note of sale. Do you want me to write him a letter?" Hugh looked at the ledger sheet. The numbers were clear and precisely written in a hand that was both efficient and, he noted irrelevantly, rather elegant. "Hartley is in Abilene," he said. "He'll say he already paid." "Do you have a record of payment?" "No." "Then I'll write him a letter. He can claim he paid, but he'll have to produce the record, and if he can't, that becomes his problem with the law, not yours." She paused. "With respect, Mr. Conroy, you need to keep better records. Every transaction documented the day it happens, not 3 weeks later." "I've been running this ranch for 9 years without documentation trouble," he said. "And you've been losing money for at least 4 of them," she said, pleasantly but firmly. "Shall I show you?" He sat with her for 2 hours that evening going through the books. She showed him, without condescension but without softening the facts either, exactly where money had leaked out through inattention, through informal agreements made without witnesses, through overcharges accepted without comparison, through cattle sales conducted on good faith and handshake when a written note would have cost nothing. By the end of the 2 hours Hugh was somewhere between impressed and unsettled, which was not a combination of feelings he was used to. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked. She had her elbows on the table, which was informal, but it was late and the lamp between them was burning low, and the moment had a settled quality that made formality seem beside the point. "My father was a freight company owner," she said. "I kept his books from the time I was 16. When he died, I kept them for the man who bought the company. When that man's son decided he wanted to run the accounts himself, I went to Kansas City and kept books for a dry goods company." She paused. "I've been keeping somebody's accounts my whole life. I'm good at it." "I can see that," Hugh said. She looked at him in a way that he couldn't quite categorize, a look that was neither flirtatious nor entirely professional but something in the middle, the look of someone who had been told they were competent and was quietly, privately glad of it. "I'll write to Mr. Hartley in the morning," she said, and closed the ledger book. The second thing Hugh had to admit was that she fit into the rhythm of the ranch with an ease that he found, against his will, both suspicious and admirable. He had spent several years running a property with 18 hands, and the absolute conviction that women brought complication. And what he observed instead was that Eva Wells brought efficiency. She reorganized the supply ordering system so that Pete's deliveries came in 2 organized loads instead of the scattered, often redundant mess they had been. She negotiated directly with the feed store in Caldwell by letter, citing the discrepancy in their charges, and received not only an apology but a small credit. She kept the accounts daily as she had advised him to, and within 2 weeks the ledgers looked like something a man could actually use to understand his own business. She ate breakfast with the hands sometimes, because she was up early and Rufus cooked for everyone, and the kitchen table was large. She learned every man's name in the first week. She did not flirt with any of them, which Hugh noticed, though he told himself he was not paying attention. She was direct with them in the way she was direct with everyone, without warmth or coldness but with a level, honest regard that the men, to Hugh's continuing surprise, responded to with a kind of straightforward respect. Clem, the young hand, was the exception. Clem had clearly developed a serious case of admiration for Eva Wells by the end of the first week, which Hugh observed with the detached attention of a man who was definitely not having any feelings of his own on the subject. Clem found reasons to be near the barn when she was working in the tack room office. He asked her questions about Kansas City. He once spent 45 minutes explaining the properties of different rope fibers to her, and she had listened with what Hugh suspected was gracious tolerance, though she had given nothing away in her expression. "Clem," Hugh said one morning when the boys' errand inventing had reached a particular peak, "the south fence isn't going to fix itself." "Yes, sir," Clem said, going red to his collar, and rode off without further elaboration. Hugh went into the barn to check on the mare, who was close to foaling, and found Eva sitting at the small desk in the tack room with the ledger open and a cup of coffee at her elbow. The morning light came through the single high window and caught the loose strands of her hair in a way that he noticed and immediately moved past. "South fence," she said without looking up. "Needed fixing," he said. She made a small sound that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, and went back to her figures. It was the 3rd week of October when the trouble came up from Caldwell in the form of a rider. Hugh was in the north pasture with 3 of his hands, looking at a section of creek that had begun to run muddy after the last rains, when Clem came galloping up on his pinto with the particular urgency of someone delivering news they're not sure how to present. "There's a man at the house," Clem said, pulling up his horse. "Says his name is Briggs, says he's looking for a woman named Eva Wells." Hugh did not visibly react, which was its own kind of reaction. "Where is she?" "She's in the barn. I came straight to you." "Good." Hugh turned to his foreman, a steady-tempered man named Walt Driscoll, who had been with the Conroy ranch for 7 years. "Walt, I'll be back." He rode in at a pace that was not quite a gallop but was faster than his usual measured trot. By the time he reached the yard, the man standing at his porch was already half a picture Hugh could read clearly. Charlie Briggs was perhaps 45, running to fat at the middle, with the studied ease of a man who was used to having a sheriff cousin within shouting distance. He had 2 riders with him, hard-looking men who stayed on their horses and watched the yard with the professional indifference of hired muscle. "You Conroy?" Briggs said when Hugh dismounted. "I am," Hugh said. "This is private land. What's your business?" "Looking for a woman, Eva Wells. She skipped out of Caldwell owing me $60 for board and meals at my establishment. She told me the debt was settled and she has the receipts," Hugh said. "If your claim is legitimate, you can file it with the county judge in Wellington. That's the appropriate process." Briggs smiled in a way that suggested he found legal process charming as a concept and rarely felt bound by it. "Wellington's a long ride," he said. "Be a lot easier if she just came out and we settled this directly." "That's not going to happen on my property," Hugh said. "I'd recommend you ride back to Caldwell and speak to a judge." Briggs looked around the yard with deliberate slowness, taking in the barn, the bunkhouse, the main house as if he were appraising something. "Nice spread," he said. "Be a shame if it had trouble. Are you making a threat on my property?" Hugh asked. His voice had not changed in temperature or volume, but something in it had shifted like the quality of air before a storm, and Briggs's hired riders moved very slightly in their saddles. "Just making conversation," Briggs said, but he gathered his reins. "Enjoy your ride back," Hugh said. He watched them go until they crested the rise and disappeared, then he turned and walked to the barn. Eva was at her desk, and he could tell from the particular set of her shoulders as she sat that she had heard at least some part of the exchange, possibly all of it, and that she was working very hard at appearing calm. "He'll be back," she said without turning around. "Probably," Hugh agreed. He came to stand in the doorway of the tack room. "You have those receipts you mentioned." She opened the lower drawer of the desk and pulled out a small leather wallet, the kind that folded flat. She laid it open on the desk and spread out 3 pieces of paper, all of them neat, all of them dated. "Board for 6 weeks, paid in full. I paid in cash. He gave me these receipts himself." She looked up. "His saloon is the only lodging he actually makes money from, and he raises the rates after women move in and then claims they underpaid. I've talked to 2 other women it happened to. He does it regularly, and the sheriff doesn't touch him." Hugh looked at the receipts. They were genuine, clear, signed in Briggs's own hand. "I'll write to the county sheriff in Wellington," he said. "I already did," she said. "2 weeks ago. I haven't had a response." He looked at her. "You've been managing this on your own the whole time." "I'm used to managing things on my own," she said, not bitterly, just factually. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. "The receipts are solid," he said finally. "Keep them safe." "I always do," she said, and turned back to the ledger. What happened that evening was not planned by either of them. It was simply a consequence of the barn, which was where Hugh went after supper to check on the mare, and where Eva also went for reasons she explained afterward as curiosity about the foaling, and where they both ended up sitting on opposite sides of the mare's stall as the first cold snap of the season pushed through the gaps in the boards, and the lantern between them made everything amber and warm. The mare was not yet ready to foal. She was restless but not distressed, moving in slow circles in the large stall. Hugh sat on a hay bale with his back against the wall and watched her, and Eva sat on the other side with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them in a posture that looked, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely unguarded. "Do you always sit with them?" she asked. "When it's close," he said. "My father taught me that. He said a horse that foals alone for the first time can have trouble, and if you're there, you can help. And he said it costs you nothing to be there." She was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a good man." "He died in '78, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in a way that was not formal condolence but something more direct. "Father?" he asked. 1876, she said. "He'd been sick a long time. When I say the freight company owner bought the business, what I mean is that he bought it for almost nothing because my father had already spent most of what it was worth on doctors." She said it without self-pity. "I negotiated the sale myself. I was 21. The company lawyer kept trying to address my father instead of me, even though my father could barely sit upright. I just kept redirecting the conversation." "That must have been difficult," Hugh said. She considered the word. "It was necessary," she said. "Difficult things often are." They sat with the mare for another hour and a half. The conversation moved in the unhurried way of conversation late at night in a warm space with a good reason to stay. They talked about the ranch, about the cattle market, about what the railroad's expansion was doing to the Texas economy, about Kansas City, and whether it deserved its reputation for rough edges. They talked about books, which surprised Hugh because he had not expected it, and she had clearly not expected him to have read as widely as he had, which she admitted by saying, "You've read more than I assumed," in a tone of genuine self-correction. "Winters are long here," he said. "I suppose they are," she said. When the mare settled and it became clear she would not foal that night, they walked back across the yard toward the barn's main entrance, and the cold had fully arrived while they sat, turning the air sharp and clear, the stars overhead impossibly numerous. Eva stopped for a moment and tilted her head back to look at them, her breath clouding faintly in front of her. "I grew up in St. Louis," she said. "You can't see the stars like this in the city." Hugh looked at the sky too, though he had seen it 1,000 times and never fully stopped seeing it. "No," he agreed. "You can't." She looked at him then briefly, the starlight doing something different to her expression than lamplight did, something softer around the edges. Then she said good night and went to the tack room, and Hugh stood in the cold yard for an extra minute or two before going in himself. In the weeks that followed, the change between them was gradual, and then suddenly not gradual at all. It was November now, and the weather had committed to cold, and the evenings at the ranch had the quality of being pulled inward toward warmth and firelight. Eva had been eating supper at the main house with increasing regularity, at first because Hugh had asked her to go over the accounts after the meal, and then because the going over accounts became shorter and the conversation afterward became longer, and neither of them directly acknowledged the shift. She brought her own coffee cup the third week, which she set on the shelf next to his without comment. He noticed it there when he came in from the morning check, and found it unreasonable how pleased he was by the sight of it. She had a dry, quick humor that surfaced in odd moments and vanished just as quickly, like a fish in a clear stream, there, and then gone before you could be certain you'd seen it. She was sharp about politics and had opinions about the cattle legislation that Conroy himself shared, which made conversation interesting in a way that most of his conversations were not. She was unsentimental about most things, which meant that the moments when sentiment surfaced in her were worth paying attention to. A note in her voice when she mentioned her father, the way she put her hand briefly on the nose of the foaling mare when they finally sat with her through delivery on a cold Tuesday night, the occasion on which she came across a copy of Jane Austen's Persuasion on Hugh's bookshelf and held it for a long moment before putting it carefully back. "Have you read it?" he asked. "Several times," she said. "My mother's copy. I left it in Kansas City." He took it off the shelf and set it on the side of the shelf closest to her, without comment. The next morning it was gone from there, and he supposed she had taken it to the tack room, and he found himself glad she had it. Briggs came back in November, not himself this time but through the county sheriff in Caldwell, a man named Avery, who rode out on a mild afternoon with a paper that claimed to be a legal writ requiring Eva Wells to appear and answer a debt claim. Hugh looked at the paper, then at Sheriff Avery, then at Pete Dawson, who had arrived that same morning with the supply run and was now watching from the wagon seat with transparent concern. "This is a civil matter," Hugh said. "You can't compel her appearance with this paper. This isn't a criminal warrant." Avery was an older man, uncomfortable in the way of a person who knows they're being used and has made their peace with it. "Mr. Briggs filed a claim with the county. Then it goes to a judge," Hugh said. "I've already written to the county seat in Wellington. I expect to hear back shortly. In the meantime, Miss Wells is employed on this property, and that is where she will remain." He had not actually written to Wellington yet. He did so that same afternoon, with Eva's receipts copied out in careful detail, and he sent the letter with Pete when Pete left 2 days later. December brought the response from Wellington. A judge named Aldrich had reviewed the documents and found in Eva's favor. The debt claim was dismissed. Briggs was censured in the formal language of county law, which would cost him nothing practically, but would make it considerably harder for him to try the same scheme again without more serious consequences. The letter was addressed to Eva, and Hugh brought it to her in the tack room office without opening it. She read it standing up, and when she had finished reading it, she stood still for a moment with her hands holding the paper and her face doing something complicated that resolved, finally, into relief. Not the theatrical relief of someone reprieved from great danger, but the quiet, deep relief of someone who has been carrying a tension for a long time and has just been permitted to set it down. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She looked at him, and in her eyes was something he recognized now because he had been watching it slowly build for weeks and trying not to acknowledge it. Gratitude, yes, but layered underneath gratitude and underneath the layers. A warmth that had been there for a while now and that she had kept carefully managed. The way you manage a fire in a room that has dry wood too close to the walls. "Thank you," she said, "for writing to Wellington. For the letter. You'd already handled most of it yourself," he said. I hadn't handled the part where you stood on your own porch and told Briggs to take his threats elsewhere," she said. He had not particularly thought of that as anything remarkable, but from her tone he understood that she had. He understood that for a woman who had been managing everything herself for a long time, the experience of someone else standing between her and a threat, without being asked and without expectation of repayment, was not a small thing. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and the silence between them was the kind that is not empty. It was Walt, his foreman, who eventually said the thing that Hugh had been not saying to himself for weeks. They were out mending a fence on the East Range on a cold December morning, Walt working the wire stretcher while Hugh set posts, and Walt said without particular preamble, "She's good for this place." "She does good work," Hugh agreed. "That's not what I said," Walt said, in the way of a man who has been foreman long enough to say what he means to the man who employs him. Hugh set the post without responding. "Also," Walt said, "she looks at you when you're not looking." "Fix the fence, Walt," Hugh said. Walt smiled at the fence wire and said nothing further. Christmas came to the Conroy Ranch in the way it came to most working ranches in the Texas Hill Country in 1883. Practically, without ceremony, though Rufus made a roast, and there was a bottle of whiskey opened, and the hands came to the main house for an hour in the evening. Eva had made a pie from the dried apples in the larder, which was remarkable to everyone because it was the best thing that had come out of that kitchen since the previous Christmas when Rufus had, for reasons never fully explained, made a chocolate cake that was considered legendary. The hands ate pie and told stories and left before 8, and then it was just Hugh and Eva at the table, and the fire, and the whiskey bottle, and the particular quiet of a winter night on open range when the wind has gone still. She had a small glass of whiskey, which she held in both hands and sipped thoughtfully. She had put her hair down tonight, which was the first time Hugh had seen it down, and it fell past her shoulders in loose auburn waves, and he was doing an admirable job of not thinking about it. "My first Christmas in Texas," she said. "How does it compare?" he asked. "It's quiet," she said. "In a good way. Kansas City has a great deal of noise at Christmas. Everyone performing their holiday for everyone else." She looked at the fire. "This feels more honest. It's just a ranch," he said. "That's what I mean," she said, and she smiled at him. Not her dry, quick smile, but something different, something warmer and more open. And Hugh, who was 32 years old and had run 40,000 acres of cattle land for 9 years and had considered himself a man who had the measure of most things, found that he had not entirely prepared for the effect of Eva Wells smiling at him in firelight with her hair down. "Eva," he said, and then stopped. She looked at him steadily. She had a quality of stillness that he had always admired, the capacity to be entirely present without agitation, to wait without anxiety. She was waiting now. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to be clear about it beforehand because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about what you're free to say in response." "All right," she said. "You are employed here," he said, "and you will remain employed here as long as you want to be, regardless of anything else. That is separate and not dependent on anything. Do you understand that?" "I understand," she said. Her voice was very steady. "Good," he said. "Because what I also want to tell you is that I have spent the last 2 months trying very hard not to notice things about you, and I have been almost entirely unsuccessful, and I think you deserve to know that, because I think you are someone who would rather know than not know." The fire crackled. Eva looked at him for a long moment with her amber-brown eyes and the loose waves of her hair and the whiskey glass in both hands. "What kind of things?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "The way you manage things," he said. "The way you listen. The way you handled Briggs and the ledgers and Clem with his rope explanation. The way you put your hand on the mare when she was foaling." He paused, "The freckle below your left ear." She was quiet. "Then you noticed that." "I noticed it the first morning," he admitted. "That seemed like enough information to work with." She set the whiskey glass down on the table carefully and then she said, "I want to tell you something in return." "All right," he said. I came here because Pete told me you needed a bookkeeper and because I needed to be somewhere Briggs couldn't reach me, she said. Those were my reasons, and they were true. But I want you to know that they stopped being my only reasons a long time ago. Somewhere around the time we sat with the mayor in the barn the first time and you told me your father said it cost you nothing to be there. He looked at her. Because that is exactly the kind of man I would choose to know, she said. And I have been trying to be practical about it, which has also not been entirely successful. Hugh got up from his chair and came around the table, and Eva stood up to meet him in a way that was characteristic of her, not waiting, not passive, meeting things as they came. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, and he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him, and he lifted his hand and tucked the loose strand of hair back from her jaw in a gesture that was quiet and certain and entirely deliberate. "Eva," he said. "Hugh," she said, and she said his name as if she had been saving it, as if she had been carrying it around carefully for weeks and was only now permitted to set it down properly. He kissed her. She kissed him back with all the directness and quiet certainty that characterized everything else she did, and the fire in the hearth made the room amber and warm, and outside the ranch lay quiet and still under a cold, clear winter sky. January came in hard on the Conroy spread, bringing 2 weeks of sustained cold that kept the hands in the bunkhouse more than usual and kept the cattle bunched in the low pastures near the creek where the wind didn't cut as sharp. Hugh and Eva settled into a new configuration of things that was not announced to anyone and did not need to be, because on a working ranch of 18 men, the configuration of things is generally understood within about 48 hours. What it meant practically was that the conversations after supper were no longer about accounts, or were not only about accounts. It meant that Hugh found himself looking up from whatever he was doing in the yard to find her when she was not immediately visible, and then relocating his attention to the task at hand, with the slightly irritated efficiency of a man who has discovered a new habit in himself. It meant that Eva, for her part, brought her coffee cup to the main house at breakfast now instead of keeping it in the tack room, and Rufus set a second place for her at the table without being asked, which was Rufus's way of rendering a verdict. The hands adjusted. Clem got over his 19-year-old admiration with the speed characteristic of young men, which is to say he found other things to be interested in. Walt continued to say nothing further about the matter, which was his way of saying everything. The 2 other senior hands, a quiet Mexican cowboy named Carlos Reyes and a weathered Texan named Franklin, treated Eva with the same practical respect they had always shown her, which was their way of approving. There was a cattle issue in January that required Hugh to ride out to the western edge of the property for 3 days, checking on losses from the cold snap, and dealing with a fence break that had let 40 head of cattle drift onto the neighboring property, which belonged to a man named Harmon, who was not particularly flexible about boundary disputes. Walt went with him, and they spent 3 cold days in the saddle working it out. He came back to find the main house warm, a proper meal on the stove, and the accounts of the cattle loss already calculated and entered into the ledger. Eva had also drafted a letter to Harmon on behalf of the ranch, politely acknowledging the fence issue and proposing a split of the labor cost for repairs, which was a better solution than Hugh had been planning to offer, which was to say nothing and simply fix the fence. "Harmon will appreciate the acknowledgement," she said when Hugh pointed this out. "He's a man who wants to be respected. Ignoring the issue will make him difficult. Acknowledging it makes him an ally." Hugh thought about this. "You've never met Harmon," he said. "No," she said, "but I've managed a lot of difficult men through letters." He looked at the draft letter. It was correct in every particular. "You're very good at this," he said. She accepted the observation with the simplicity of someone who knew it to be true and did not require ceremony around it. But she also looked pleased in the particular way she had, that slightly contained, private pleasure, as if she kept her joy close because she had learned not to rely on it lasting. That last part was something Hugh was still learning the shape of. Eva Wells was not a woman who had been treated carelessly, exactly, But she was a woman who had learned very early that the world did not automatically make provision for her, that whatever she needed she would need to build or earn or arrange herself. It had made her competent and self-sufficient and direct, and it had also made her careful with hope, the way you're careful with an oil lamp in a windstorm. He was learning to be patient with that. He was learning that reassurance, for her, was most useful when it was concrete. The letter to Wellington, the standing between her and Briggs on his own porch, the regular appointment of her name in conversations as someone whose judgment was trusted. She received sentiment less easily than she received evidence, so he tried to be a man whose actions produced evidence she could work with. He did not know if he was always successful. But in February, when the cold finally broke and the first tentative warmth came back to the land, she came to stand beside him one evening on the porch and put her hand through his arm in a gesture that was simple and whole and not tentative at all, and he thought that on balance he was probably doing something right. February also brought a letter from his mother in San Antonio. His mother was a formidable woman of 60 who had raised Hugh and his 3 younger siblings on the proceeds of a small boarding house after his father's death, and who communicated entirely by letter now that Hugh was on the ranch and she was in the city. The letter in question inquired, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had raised 4 children and knew how to get to the point, whether there was anything she should know about the woman currently employed on his property, because she had heard from Mrs. Hennessy in Caldwell, who had heard from Pete Dawson, who had mentioned the situation in conversation while picking up supplies. Hugh read this letter at the breakfast table. He set it down and looked at Eva, who was eating her eggs and reading over the previous week's tally sheets and had not looked up. "My mother writes to ask about you," he said. Eva looked up. "What does she say?" "She says she's heard there's a woman on my property, and she wants to know what she should know about it." Eva put down the tally sheets. She considered Hugh with the direct amber-brown regard that he had come to understand meant she was thinking carefully before she spoke. "What do you want to tell her?" she said. "I want to tell her I'm thinking of asking you to marry me," Hugh said, "but I wanted to ask you first before I wrote it in a letter to my mother." The quality of the silence that followed was notable. Outside, a jay was making a lot of noise in the cottonwood tree near the well, and somewhere in the barn Rufus was singing something tuneless. Inside the kitchen, it was very quiet. Eva was looking at him. Her expression was doing several things at once which he had learned to be patient with, because she had a great many internal processes that she ran quickly and privately before arriving at a response, and interrupting the process was not useful. "You're thinking of it," she said. "I've been thinking of it since December," he said. "I wanted to be certain it was the right thing to say before I said it. I am now certain." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I moved here with a trunk, no references, and a legal dispute. You had a rule about women on your land. I broke it before I unpacked." "You did," he said, "and here we are." She looked at him, and the thing that happened in her eyes was the same thing that had happened in the barn in December when she had said his name as if she had been saving it. A kind of release, a carefully managed tension dissolving, the oil lamp steadying in the windstorm. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you if you're asking." "I'm asking," he said. She nodded once, in the manner of a woman confirming a good decision, and then she picked up her tally sheets again, and Hugh wrote a letter to his mother that he suspected she had been anticipating for at least 6 weeks. The wedding was in March, on a mild afternoon that carried the smell of new grass from the pastures. Hugh's mother came up from San Antonio on the stage. A small, sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Conroy, who descended from the coach, looked at Eva for approximately 30 seconds and then said, "She'll do," in a tone that Hugh recognized as his mother's highest form of approval. Eva, to her credit, received this assessment without blinking and said, "I hope so, Mrs. Conroy," in a tone that was respectful without being deferential, which Hugh could tell his mother found satisfactory. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a tall, thin man named Brother Michaels who came through the county every 6 weeks and who seemed genuinely moved by the occasion despite having performed perhaps 300 of them. Walt stood up with Hugh. Eva had no family present, but she had written to a woman in Kansas City, a friend from her time there, and the friend, whose name was Clara Bates, had arrived 2 days before on the stage with a hat that was significantly more elaborate than anything else worn in Caldwell County that season. Clara Bates was loud, cheerful, and had clearly known Eva for long enough to be fiercely partisan on her behalf. She spent the evening before the wedding telling Hugh, with great directness, what an admirable person Eva was, which Hugh found both charming and largely unnecessary since he had been arriving at that conclusion on his own for months. But he listened, because he understood that this was Clara's way of doing for Eva what Eva's family was not present to do, and that was worth respecting. Eva wore a dress that was not white, because white was impractical and she was a practical woman, but a soft cream-colored wool that brought the warm tones of her complexion forward and was the finest thing in her trunk. She had done her hair herself in a loose arrangement with a few small wildflowers that Clara had somehow located despite March's limited offerings in the Texas Hill Country. She looked, Hugh thought, when she came around the side of the barn where the small gathered company was standing in the mild afternoon sun, like someone who was walking toward what she had chosen with her whole self, without reservation and without looking back. Brother Michael said the words. Hugh and Eva said the words back. Walt looked dignified. Clara cried loudly and did not appear embarrassed about it. Rufus had made a proper cake, which was almost certainly the real reason the hands had shown up with such alacrity. His mother took his arm after the ceremony and walked with him a few steps away from the group. "She's good," Margaret Conroy said, watching Eva in conversation with the hands, who were getting cake and talking with the easy warmth of people who had already decided they approved. "She's steady. She'll be a good partner for you." "I know," Hugh said. His mother looked up at him with the sharp eyes she'd used to see through every evasion of his childhood. "You're happy," she said, with the faint surprise of a woman who had worried about her oldest child's solitary tendencies for a considerable number of years. "I am," he said. She patted his arm. "Good," she said. "Your father would have liked her." The spring and summer of 1884 settled into the Conroy ranch with the sense of things finding their right shape. Eva moved fully into the main house, which involved a certain reorganization of the study where she kept the accounts, which involved the clearing out of approximately 3 years of accumulated paperwork, broken equipment, and one category of object that Hugh described as reference materials, and that Eva described as things you put down and forgot about. The reorganization took 4 days and produced a study that was, for the first time in years, possible to work in efficiently. She was also, quietly and without making it a significant announcement, changing the rhythm of the house in other ways. She made decisions about the garden that had gone to seed and replanted it with practical things. Kitchen herbs, some vegetables, one section of flowers that served no practical purpose whatsoever, and that she tended with the focused pleasure of someone who has been sensible for a long time and is allowing themselves one small indulgence. She negotiated with the woman who ran the seamstress shop in Caldwell to have curtains made for the main house windows, which had been bare since Hugh's father's time. They were a plain blue cotton that matched nothing in particular and made the rooms look, for the first time, inhabited. Hugh noticed all of this. He had spent 9 years in this house with the particular quality of bachelor occupancy, functional, stripped of anything not strictly necessary, the kind of space that exists to shelter rather than to welcome. The blue curtains, the herb garden, the reorganized study, the second coffee cup that was now always on the shelf, the copy of Persuasion on the desk in the evenings. These were not large things. But they were real, and the house felt different for them in a way that Hugh found, every time he walked through the door, quietly remarkable. They fell into the habit of riding together in the early mornings when the ranch work permitted it, before the day fully committed to its demands. The Texas landscape in the early morning was something Hugh had lived with his whole life, and that Eva received with a fresh attention that occasionally made him see it differently. The way she might pull up her horse on the ridge and look out over the grass as it caught the angle of the new sun, or notice the particular way the creek bottoms ran green against the brown hillsides in the summer heat. "My mother used to say that people who live with beautiful things stop seeing them," she said one morning on the ridge, looking out over the spread with the breeze pulling at the loose pieces of her hair. She said the point of traveling was to see familiar things strangely, to get a new angle. "She sounds like someone who thought carefully about things," Hugh said. "She did," Eva said. "She died when I was 14. She had very sound opinions about a great many things and not enough time to express them all, which was a loss to everyone." She said it simply, without drama, and Hugh recognized the way she carried that loss. Matter-of-factly, the way you carry anything you've been carrying long enough that it has settled into the natural weight of who you are. He reached across and took her hand where it rested on her saddle horn, and she turned it palm up and laced her fingers through his without looking away from the view, and they stayed like that for a while on the ridge with the wind and the sun and the grass below them, before the horses shifted, and the day called them back down. In the fall of 1884, Eva told him she was expecting, on an October morning when the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek had gone golden and were just beginning to let go. She told him at breakfast, with the directness that was her nature and that he had long since stopped being surprised by. She set a cup of coffee in front of him, sat down across from him and said, "I think we're going to need to think about which room to convert." He looked up. She was watching him with those amber-brown eyes, calm and steady, and underneath the calm there was the same quality he had observed on Christmas night when she told him she had stopped being practical about her feelings for him. Carefully contained warmth, the oil lamp in the windstorm, held steady by will until she knew the wind was going to behave. He pushed back from the table and came around to her side and pulled her up and held her, and she put her arms around him and pressed her face against his shoulder, and for a long moment neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. "The room across from the study," he said finally, into her hair. He felt her smile against his shoulder. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. Margaret Conroy came up from San Antonio in March of 1885, when her first grandchild arrived on a mild afternoon that was somehow fitting, given that Hugh and Eva's wedding had also happened on a mild March afternoon, as if the season had decided to be consistent. The child was a boy, healthy and loud, and equipped with a remarkable capacity for expressing displeasure that Clara Bates, who had also come back for the occasion, and was showing every indication of finding reasons to stay in Caldwell County indefinitely, described as an admirable set of lungs. They named him James, after Hugh's father, which was Eva's suggestion, made without sentiment, but with the careful regard she had always shown for the things that mattered to Hugh. Margaret Conroy held her grandson with the practiced certainty of a woman who had raised 4 children and found the procedure familiar, and she looked up at Hugh with an expression that was as close to openly emotional as she was likely to get, which was to say her eyes were bright and her voice was steady only through evident effort. "James," she said. "Yes. Good." Hugh stood beside Eva, who was sitting up in the bed with the particular dignity of a woman who had just done something requiring great effort and knows it, and he held her hand, and she leaned very slightly into his arm, and outside the window the March light was the same copper gold it had been on the morning Eva Wells had arrived on the back of Pete Dawson's wagon and unfastened her trunk before anyone had given her permission. He thought about that morning sometimes, about the rule he had kept for years and the ease with which it had been overturned by a woman with capable hands and an amber-brown gaze and a silver ring on her middle finger. He had constructed the rule out of the wreckage of a complicated situation in 1878 and had told himself it was about practicality, and he had believed himself completely until the moment he had not. The truth, which was something he had worked out over the course of many conversations and one barn-lit winter night, was that the rule had not been about practicality at all but about risk, about the particular risk of sharing a life and a land and a future with someone whose departure would cost you something real. He had been managing that risk by eliminating the variable. Eva had eliminated his system instead, before her trunk was off the wagon, and the land had not suffered for it. The land had, by any reasonable accounting, benefited. The accounts were in order. The fences were maintained. The mornings had someone to ride with. The house had blue curtains and a herb garden and a coffee cup on the shelf, and now a boy named James in the room across from the study, who at 3 weeks of age had already demonstrated that he had his mother's directness and his father's capacity for stubbornness, which Margaret Conroy said with considerable authority was simply what happened when you combined those two particular temperaments. James Conroy grew into a sturdy, curious toddler with his mother's brown eyes and his father's jaw, who by the time he was 2 years old had a thorough enough familiarity with the barn and the horses and the yard that Clem, now 22 and a capable hand, could be trusted to follow him around and explain what everything was and why. He was not a quiet child, having inherited the lungs Clara Bates had noted, but he was not an unreasonable one. He had a quality of directness in his small demands that the hands found charming, and that Hugh recognized with the private amusement of a man who sees his own face in the mirror. 1886 was a good year for the ranch. The cattle market was strong. The spring had been wet enough to set the grass high, and Hugh's accounts, maintained now by Eva with the precision she had brought to everything, showed the best returns the property had seen in a decade. He bought 300 additional head in the summer, extending the operation into the north pastures that his father had always intended to use and never gotten to. Walt, promoted to full ranch manager in the spring with a corresponding increase in wage, managed the expansion with his usual untroubled competence. Eva hired a girl from town to help in the house, a 16-year-old named Daisy Sullivan, who was the daughter of a local farm family, and who regarded Eva with the wide-eyed attention of someone observing a model of a thing they had not previously known existed. A woman who managed a household, ran accounts for a large ranch operation, and was clearly the partner rather than the dependent in her marriage, all simultaneously and without apparent effort. Eva was patient with Daisy and direct about what she expected and generous when Daisy delivered it, and within a month, Daisy Sullivan was as quietly competent as Eva seemed to expect everyone to become in her vicinity. Clara Bates did, in fact, find a reason to stay in Caldwell County. The reason presented itself in the spring of 1886 in the form of Dr. Edmund Pace, who had arrived in Caldwell the previous fall to set up the county's first proper medical practice, and who had encountered Clara at the church social in November and been thoroughly disarranged by her ever since. Clara wrote to Eva about it in the breathless, somewhat chaotic style of her letters, which Eva read at the breakfast table with periodic interjections of "Oh, Clara," in a tone that managed to convey both amusement and genuine happiness. She says he asked her to take a walk and then forgot where he was going, Eva reported to Hugh. He's a doctor, Hugh said, as if this explained something. She says she reminded him where they were going, and he said she was the most capable woman he had ever met. Is that what passes for romance with doctors? She seemed to think so, Eva said, and they were both grinning over their coffee, which was the sort of moment that Hugh collected privately and without ceremony, the moments that made up the actual texture of a good life, ordinary and warm and theirs. Clara married Dr. Pace in the fall of 1886, and Eva went to Caldwell for the wedding with James on her hip and Hugh beside her, and the four of them ate dinner together that evening at the hotel, and Clara told the story of the walk 3 times to different audiences, and Dr. Pace looked at her each time with the expression of a man who has encountered something that rearranged his understanding of the world and has not stopped being grateful for it. Hugh and Eva rode home under a clear October sky with James asleep in Eva's arms on the wagon bench, heavy with the weightless trust of small children's sleep. The land was dark on either side of the road and the stars were out in their thousands, and Eva was quiet the way she was quiet when she was thinking about something large. "What is it?" Hugh asked. "Nothing sad," she said. "I was thinking about Clara. She's been my closest friend for 12 years. I was worried she would be alone." "She found a good man," Hugh said. "She did," Eva agreed. "And then, quietly, I found a good man too." He put his arm around her on the bench, careful of James, and she leaned into him and they rode the last miles home in the quiet dark. And the house, when they reached it, had its lights on and the blue curtains in the windows, and it looked like what it was, which was a place where people lived and were glad of it. In the spring of 1888, Eva told him again at breakfast, with the same direct economy of language. She said, "I think James is going to need the other room converted soon." He looked at her. She looked at him. He was around the table in about 4 seconds. Their second child was a girl, born in October of 1888 on an evening when the leaves outside were at their full color, and the light through the window was bronze and gold. They named her Catherine, after Eva's mother, which had been Hugh's suggestion, and which Eva had received with a quality of silence that told him everything he needed to know about how much it meant to her. Catherine Conroy arrived in the world with her father's gray-green eyes and a temperament that was significantly more deliberate than her brother's, observing the yard and the animals and the people around her with a contemplative attention that the hands found either unnerving or fascinating, depending on their own temperaments. James, at 3 years old, received his sister with the mixture of proprietary pride and competitive caution typical of firstborn children, and by the time Catherine was 6 months old had decided she was satisfactory and taken it upon himself to explain the ranch to her in exhaustive detail, which she received with her characteristic thoughtful attention, which he appeared to take as confirmation of her good judgment. The ranch continued to grow. The years between 1888 and 1892 were the years of Hugh's full maturity as a cattleman. The operation expanded again. The accounts that Eva managed told a story of steady, disciplined growth, and the Conroy spread became known in the surrounding counties as one of the best-run properties in that part of Texas. People said it was the new hands, the better breeding stock, the improved management. People who knew the ranch better said it was Eva Conroy's accounts and Hugh Conroy's judgment working together in the way that two things working together are better than either alone. Pete Dawson retired from his supply route in 1890, at 69 years old, with the joints he'd always had but fewer teeth, and came to the ranch for a farewell meal that Rufus cooked with unprecedented ambition. Pete sat at the table and ate, and told the story of the morning he had driven Eva Wells out to the Conroy spread on the back of his wagon for perhaps the 100th time, with the familiar embellishments that the story had accumulated over 7 years of retelling. In Pete's current version, Hugh had been standing on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw set like a man prepared to repel an invasion, and Eva had climbed out of the wagon with the regal calm of a general surveying a field she had already decided was hers, and had unfastened her trunk while Hugh was still in the middle of explaining why she couldn't. The general shape of this was accurate, and neither Hugh nor Eva corrected the embellishments. "Best supply delivery I ever made," Pete said, raising his cup of coffee in a toast. "To Pete," Hugh said, raising his own. "To Pete," Eva agreed, smiling across the table at the old man who had, in his cheerful, roundabout way, changed the course of her life by knowing when a situation called for a little creative supply routing. There was a bad stretch in 1891, when a drought came in late summer and held through September, and the grass on the south pastures burned to nothing, and they had to sell 40 head early at prices that were not what they should have been, because the market knew a drought year when it saw one and priced accordingly. Hugh spent those months riding the fence lines and the creek beds with Walt, monitoring the water levels, making decisions about which pastures to rest and which cattle to move, the constant arithmetic of a rancher managing scarce resource. Eva managed the financial arithmetic with the same focused calm. She came to him one evening in August with the ledger and laid it out clearly. What they had spent, what they could spend, what the realistic outcome was if the drought held through October versus through December. She did not soften the numbers, but she had also identified 3 possibilities he had not considered, including a short-term note from the county agricultural bank that could bridge a gap if needed. "You've already thought through the scenarios," he said. "I went through all of them twice," she said. "The note is the last resort. I think if you move the north herd to the creek bottom pastures now, before the other ranchers need to, you'll hold enough grass in the south to make it through September without selling further." He did exactly that, and it worked, or close enough to working that the difference was manageable. By October the rains came back and the grass recovered, and the crisis resolved without the bank note. He told her afterward that the decision about the north herd had been hers, and she said it had been based on his knowledge of the pasture conditions, which was true, and he said it had been based on her reading of the market and the timeline, which was also true, and they agreed that the point was it had worked, which was the same conclusion they usually reached when they tried to apportion credit between them. Walt married in 1892, a widow named Susan who had a small property north of town and 2 grown sons who worked it. The wedding was at Susan's ranch, and the whole Conroy crew attended, and James at 7 years old was formally introduced to the concept of the wedding ceremony, which he found interesting primarily for the food. Catherine at 4 sat through the ceremony with her contemplative gray-green eyes wide, absorbing the proceedings with the thoroughness she brought to all information, and told Eva afterward that she thought the preacher's coat was very serious. "Weddings are serious occasions," Eva told her. Catherine considered this. "Were you serious at your wedding?" "Very," Eva said. "Was Papa?" Hugh, who was nearby, said. "I was the most serious I have ever been in my life." Catherine nodded as if this confirmed her theory, and went back to her systematic investigation of the refreshment table. The children grew. James was serious about horses, which was fitting, and had by the age of 9 developed a working relationship with the animals in the barn that was based on some combination of his father's patient attentiveness and his own natural affinity. He was also, less expectedly, interested in the account books, which he had discovered through Eva's work, and which he regarded with the focused curiosity he also brought to mechanical things and to the particular behavior of water in the creek system. Eva taught him the basics with the same directness she brought to everything, and found that he had a genuine aptitude for numbers that she cultivated without pressure, because she was a woman who understood the difference between ability and obligation. Catherine was interested in plants, specifically the herb garden her mother had planted and maintained, and threw it in the larger question of what grew where and why. She was the child who asked questions of every passing person who might know something she didn't, who listened to the hand's explanations of grass types and soil conditions and water tables with the same comprehensive attention she had always brought to information. Dr. Pace, who came out to the ranch for dinner periodically now that he and Clara were established neighbors in Caldwell County, said that Catherine Conroy was going to be a scientist, which was not a category that existed conveniently for girls in 1893 Texas, and which Eva registered with a private determination that her daughter would have every possible avenue available to her regardless. Hugh watched his wife and his daughter in the garden one late afternoon in the fall of 1893, Catherine at 5 years old crouching between the herb rows with the focused interest of a very small naturalist, Eva beside her explaining which plants went to seed in the fall and why. He was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the gold late afternoon light fall across the yard, and he was thinking about the morning Eva had arrived on the back of Pete's wagon and unfastened her trunk in the yard of a man who had a rule about such things. He was thinking about his rule, which had seemed so reasonable and which had been overturned so completely, and he was thinking about the particular quality of his life before she came and the quality of it since, and the comparison was not difficult. He had been running this land, doing it well, managing the numbers and the cattle and the crew, and the land had been productive, and the business had been sound, and he had been lonely in a way so habitual he had stopped recognizing it as loneliness and had categorized it simply as solitude. He had not known what he was missing until it arrived in a battered steamer trunk on the back of Pete Dawson's wagon with auburn hair and amber-brown eyes, and the complete assurance that she was already there and already staying. Eva looked up from the herb bed and saw him standing on the porch, and she smiled. Not the dry, quick smile, not the carefully contained warmth of their early months, but the open, full smile that had developed gradually over the years of their life together. The smile of a woman who had made her choice and found it good in every way she had known how to evaluate, and also in ways she had not known to look for. She raised one hand in a small wave, and Catherine looked up too and waved both arms with the enthusiastic unself-consciousness of a 5-year-old. And Hugh raised his coffee cup in acknowledgement and tried not to look as purely happy as he was, which was very happy indeed, by any reasonable accounting. He was not entirely successful. In 1894, with the ranch at its strongest and the accounts in the best shape they had ever been, Hugh and Eva made one significant change to the operation. They hired a second bookkeeper, a young man named Thomas Reed who had just finished a commercial education in Dallas, to assist Eva with the volume of work that the expanded property generated. It was Eva's own suggestion, made not because she could not manage the work alone, but because she had begun to have a second idea about what to do with the time the assistants would free. She had been corresponding, since the previous year, with the county school board about the state of education in Caldwell. The schoolhouse in town was a one-room building with a teacher who was replaced every year and a half on average, and a supply of books that had not been meaningfully updated since 1875. Eva had views about this. She had increasingly specific views, backed up by research conducted through correspondence with educational associations in Houston and Austin, and she was in the process of converting those views into a proposal that she was preparing to present to the county board at their spring meeting. Hugh read the proposal on a February evening in the lamplit study. It was precise, practical, and comprehensive in the way of everything Eva produced. It proposed a county education committee, an annual budget for school materials, a minimum tenure standard for teachers, and a lending library attached to the schoolhouse using books donated from private collections. It included projected costs, potential funding sources, and a 3-year implementation timeline. "You've been working on this for months," he said. "Since last August," she said. She was watching him read with the particular attention she gave to things she cared about, the focused, slightly contained quality of someone who has put real thought into something and is waiting to know if the thought was sound. "It's very good," he said. "The board may not agree," she said. "They may not," he agreed. "But you'll make the argument." She made the argument in March 1894, standing before a county school board of 7 men in the Caldwell meeting hall with her proposal in hand, and made it with the same direct, evidence-based clarity she brought to everything from account books to difficult conversations, and the board approved 4 of the 6 proposals outright and agreed to reconsider the other 2 at the next meeting. The lending library was operational by the following September, housed in 2 oak bookcases installed in the back of the schoolhouse, stocked with 93 books donated from private collections, including 30 from the Conroy Ranch Library. James, at 9 years old, was among the first readers. Catherine, not yet old enough for school, was told firmly by her brother that when she was old enough she would be expected to make use of the books, which she received with a look that suggested she had intended to do exactly that and did not require his endorsement. The years settled into the comfortable rhythm of a life fully built. The ranch in its seasons, cattle and grass and water, and the constant arithmetic of a working property. The house with its blue curtains and its herb garden, and the particular density of a place inhabited by children and work, and the accumulated domestic history of a decade together. Hugh and Eva had arguments, the real kind, about money and management decisions, and the occasional fundamental difference in how they saw a problem. And they resolved them in the way of two people who have decided that resolution is more important than winning, which is to say not always gracefully, but always with the eventual acknowledgement of what the other person had gotten right. There was an evening in 1895 when they had a serious disagreement about whether to expand the cattle operation further or invest, instead, in a diversification that Eva's research suggested might be more resilient in the long run. She had the numbers and the research and the 3-year projection. He had 12 years of direct experience with what worked on this specific land. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours with the ledgers between them, and neither entirely gave way, and went to bed without it fully resolved. And Hugh lay awake for a while thinking, and then thought about something Eva had said early in the argument that he had dismissed, and that was, he was now prepared to admit, correct. In the morning he told her he thought she was right about the diversification, and she told him that she had thought through his objections overnight, and believed his concern about the north pasture specifically was valid and should be incorporated into the plan. They made a revised plan that incorporated both positions and that Walt Driscoll, presented with it, said was the best strategic decision the ranch had made in years. "How do you always end up agreeing?" Walt asked Hugh once, genuinely curious. "We both want the same thing," Hugh said. "The ranch to work, the family to be well. We just have different ways of getting there. Usually between the two we find the right road." Walt considered this. "My first wife and I couldn't agree on what to have for breakfast," he said. "Susan is different from your first wife," Hugh pointed out. Walt smiled, which was a rare thing. "She is," he said. "She really is." The 20th century came to the Conroy Ranch as it came to most of West Texas. Slowly, with much of the same sky and grass and cattle and work as the century before, but with new things pressing at the edges. The railroad had come closer. The telephone had come to Caldwell, and Hugh had one installed at the ranch in 1901, which James, now 16, found fascinating, and which Catherine, now 13, used to call Dr. Pace's office for a conversation about a botanical question that she had not been able to answer from the books in the Caldwell Lending Library. James had grown into a young man who was his father's height and his mother's coloring, with the combination of qualities that the Conroy Ranch had always required: patience with animals, rigor with numbers, willingness to work in all weathers, and the particular steadiness that came from having been raised by two people who demonstrated it daily. He had decided, with the directness characteristic of his family, that he intended to ranch, and had begun working as a full hand the previous spring, learning the operation from the ground up with the systematic thoroughness his mother had instilled in him through years of watching her approach every problem. Catherine had decided, with equal characteristic directness, that she intended to study. The question of how was more complicated in 1902 Texas than it might have been in other places and times, but Eva had been corresponding with women's colleges in the East since Catherine was 10 years old, and Dr. Pace had connections in Austin that proved useful. And when Catherine was 17, the question was resolved. The University of Texas had admitted women since 1883, the year Eva had arrived on Pete Dawson's wagon, and Catherine Conroy was going to Austin in the fall. Eva told Hugh the news on the porch, on a summer evening in 1904 when the heat had finally let go a little and the air smelled like grass and rain. Catherine was in the house behind them, and they could hear her and James in the kitchen in the particular argument conversation of siblings who are fundamentally fond of each other and fundamentally different. Eva was holding the letter from Austin with both hands. "She's going," Eva said. "She is," Hugh agreed. "I'm very proud of her," Eva said, and her voice had the quality of something large trying to fit through a small space, which was not her usual quality. It was the quality of someone who understood that their daughter's opportunity had been built, in part, from her own efforts. The school board proposal, the lending library, the years of teaching Catherine that the questions she asked were good questions worth pursuing. Hugh put his arm around her, there on the porch in the summer evening, and she leaned into him with the ease of a woman who has been leaning into the same man for 20 years and found the arrangement uniformly good. "She gets it from her mother," he said. "She gets the stubbornness from her father," Eva said, and he laughed, and she laughed too. And inside the house, the argument conversation between James and Catherine shifted into laughter also for reasons of its own, and the evening settled around the Conroy ranch in the gold, long light of a Texas summer, and everything was as it should be. He had run this land for over 30 years now, and he knew it in the way you know only the things you have given your sustained, daily attention to over a very long time. He knew the behavior of the grass in drought and in flood. He knew which pastures held water longest and which creek bends filled with fish in the spring. He knew where his father had driven the first fence post, and he had shown the spot to James, and James had remembered it, and someday James would show it to someone else. He also knew, with the same depth and certainty, the land of Eva, the particular note in her voice when she had worked something out and was pleased about it, the way she slept on her left side always, the quality of her attention when she was reading something that genuinely interested her, the look she had on her face the morning she had sat on the back of Pete Dawson's wagon and surveyed the Conroy spread for the first time with the amber-brown eyes that had decided it was where she was going to be. He had a rule. She had broken it before her trunk was off the wagon. He had never once in 20 years wished she hadn't. The spring of 1905 was a good one, wet enough to set the grass high, warm without being brutal, the kind of spring that a rancher cataloged as a gift and a debt collector cataloged as interest on patience. Eva was 50 years old that year, which she announced at breakfast with the same matter-of-fact directness she announced everything, and Hugh told her she was the most capable woman he had ever known, which was the truth, and which she received with the fond, slightly exasperated look that 20 years of this kind of exchange had given her. James was managing the North Pasture operation with a competence that made Walt Driscoll say on multiple occasions that the ranch was in good hands, which was as strong an endorsement as Walt had ever offered about anything. Catherine was finishing her second year in Austin and writing letters home that were exhilarating and detailed, and sometimes made Eva read sections aloud at the breakfast table with her eyes lit the way they got when something was genuinely interesting to her. Clara and Edmund Pace had 3 children and a medical practice that had expanded to 2 rooms and a proper waiting area. Clara still wrote letters in the same breathless, chaotic style she had always written them, and Eva still read them at breakfast with periodic interjections, and the 2 women's friendship had deepened over 20 years into the kind of bedrock friendship that is less about excitement than about continuity, the reliable constancy of knowing someone completely. On an April morning in 1905, Hugh came in from the early check of the pastures to find Eva in the herb garden, her hands in the earth, resetting a clump of rosemary that the last rain had loosened at the roots. She was in her practical work dress and her good boots, her hair pinned up efficiently, and the morning light was on her back and on her hands in the dark earth, and on the silver at her temples that had come in gradually over the past few years, and that Hugh found no less worth noticing than the freckle below her left ear, which was still there. She heard his boots on the path and looked up, and she smiled at him, the full open smile, the one without reservation, the one she had given more freely as the years accumulated and the choices held. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "There's coffee inside." He crouched down beside her in the dirt of the herb garden, and she looked at him with a mild inquiry because he was not generally a crouching in the garden in the morning kind of man. He picked up the rosemary sprig she had set down to look at him and held it between his fingers, the sharp green smell of it filling the mild April air. "I was thinking," he said, "about the morning you arrived." "Were you?" she said. "Pete's wagon, the canvas tarp. You sitting up in the wagon bed as if you'd been waiting for someone to notice you were there." He turned the rosemary sprig in his fingers. "You started unfastening your trunk before I'd said you could stay." "I was fairly confident you'd come around," she said, with a dry, quick smile this time. "You were," he said. "You were right." He set the rosemary down carefully in the earth beside the hole she had prepared for it. "I had a rule," he said. "You did," she agreed. "You broke it before your trunk was off the wagon," he said. "I did," she agreed without any apparent regret. He looked at her in the morning light in the herb garden. His wife of 20 years, the keeper of his accounts and his confidence and his particular form of happiness. The woman who had organized his ledgers and stood her ground against Briggs, and taught their daughter to ask good questions, and stood beside him through drought years and good years, and all the ordinary years that were the real substance of a life. And he said, "It was the best rule I ever had broken." She put her hand on his jaw briefly, with the easy certainty of a woman who has been doing this for 20 years and still means it. Her eyes were the same amber brown they had always been, warm and direct and missing nothing. "I know," she said. "I knew it then too." She picked up the rosemary and settled it into the earth, pressing the soil firm around the roots with her capable hands, and Hugh knelt beside her in the April morning and helped her do it. And the land around them was in its full spring, and the cattle were in the high pastures, and the accounts were in order, and their children were well, and everything was, by any reasonable accounting, exactly as it should be.